Welcome to our deep dive into Spanish verb conjugation. We asked you all for some good sources on this, and you sent in a video from a Spanish tutor named Hemi. He
Mhm.
does a great job breaking down regular and irregular verbs in the present tense.
You know what I think is so fascinating about language learning is how it reveals the underlying logic of a culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I think today we'll explore not just the how of conjugation, but also like the why, what these verb forms tell us about how Spanish speakers view the world and express themselves.
I love that. Yeah, and Hemi starts off by introducing the three main verb groups. Those are air, and air verbs. And he gives examples like bailar to dance as the example for the are verbs, and beber to drink for the verbs, and viver to live for the verbs.
Right.
It's making me wonder if the choice of bailar is significant given how important dance is to Spanish and Latin American cultures.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
I think that it does seem intentional, like he's hinting at that expressiveness that's just embedded in the language itself.
Yeah, it's making me think about learning verbs in a whole new way. Um, he then talks about personal and impersonal forms of verbs, and that's when he dives into verb moods.
Right.
And that's where I really started getting a little lost.
Okay, well, let's break those down then.
Okay.
So personal forms of verbs are tied to those subject pronouns that we all know and love, like yo, tú, el usted, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And they tell us who is performing the action, right? So they're very specific, whereas impersonal forms are more about the action itself.
Okay.
Like in the infinitive form, to dance in English where there's no specific subject.
Okay, so I see. So when you say impersonal, it's not that the action has no connection to a person, right?
Yeah.
It's more that the form of the verb itself doesn't specify who is actually doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And then we go to verb moods, which is where things can get a little more complex, but don't worry, we'll take it step by step.
Okay. Yeah.
So we have indicative, subjunctive, and imperative moods in Spanish. The indicative, which is what we're going to be focusing on today in this deep dive, is the most straightforward one. It deals with facts and observable reality.
Okay, so it's like a reporter just stating the facts.
Exactly. No
Yeah.
opinions, just the facts.
All right, so Hamey uses hablar, which means to speak as the example, to illustrate regular SR verb conjugation in the present tense. And he shows how those endings change depending on the subject pronoun,
All right.
but the stem habl stays the same.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of regular verbs is once you grasp the pattern for one of them, you've essentially unlocked a whole category. It's like cracking a code.
Yeah, and it seems so simple when he explains it. I'm like, oh, yeah, I can totally do this. But then he stresses that memorization is still really important.
Yeah.
And so isn't there a risk, though, with that of just learning by rote without really understanding?
There's always that risk, but I think memorization provides a foundation.
Okay.
Think of it like learning scales on a piano.
Yeah.
It might seem tedious at first, but it gives you the dexterity to then play beautiful music later on.
Okay, I like that analogy. So now on to the part that always trips me up, irregular verbs. Hemi divides them into three main types. The first type are verbs like empezar, which means to start, and they form a diphthong with imi in almost all of their forms, except for the nosotros and vosotros forms.
What's fascinating about that is that those exceptions, the nosotros and vosotros forms, often preserve older forms of the language. It's like a little linguistic time capsule.
Oh, that's so interesting. So they're like holding on to a piece of the past.
Exactly.
How cool. And then there are those words like volver, which means to return that form, a diphthong, with you. Again, with the exception of, you guessed it, nosotros and vosotros.
Right.
It's almost like a game, right? Like these verbs are intentionally trying to keep us on our toes.
It does feel that way sometimes.
Yeah. And then, of course, we have verbs like otir, to hear,
Right.
where the spelling and the pronunciation just change so dramatically depending on the subject. You almost wouldn't even recognize that it's the same verb.
Yeah. Those are the ones that I find to be the most rewarding, though, because they really force you to think about the sounds and the rhythms of the language in a deeper way.
So they're the most challenging, but also kind of have the biggest payoff.
I think so.
Okay, so we've got our three verb groups, and within each group, we have to look out for those tricky irregulars.
Right.
But how do we actually, use these conjugated verbs to build sentences?
Well,
I mean, besides just, rattling off conjugations.
right. Well, Jaime points out that negation in Spanish is delightfully simple.
Okay.
You just add no before the verb.
Okay.
And questions are equally straightforward. You can simply flip the order of a subject and verb, or even keep the order the same, and just use your intonation to signal that it's a question. There's a lot of flexibility there.
Oh, that's so different from English, where we have all those auxiliary verbs to worry about.
I know Spanish is much more direct in that sense.
No.
It's all about conveying the essential meaning without too much grammatical fuss.
I love that. Okay, so we've got our conjugated verbs. We know how to make them negative. We know how to ask questions. But you might be thinking like, okay, when do I actually use the present tense?
Right.
It's about way more than just actions that are happening right now, right?
Exactly. Think of all the ways that we use the present tense in English,
Yeah.
to describe habits, general truths, things that are happening as we speak. The same applies in Spanish.
Yeah.
It's a real workhorse tense.
Okay, so I could say I eat breakfast every day using the present tense, even though I'm not actually eating breakfast at this very moment.
Exactly. You're describing a habitual action.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could say the sun rises in the east, which is general truth, again, expressed in the present tense.
Wow, so much can be packed into one tense. It's like this verb conjugation thing is just the tip of the iceberg.
It is.
There's so much more to explore.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've unpacked those basic conjugations and those 3 verb groups, and now I'm ready to get to the practical stuff.
Okay.
What tips does Jaime have for really getting a grip on these verbs? Well, his advice is fantastically down to earth.
Okay.
Even for irregular verbs,
Wait.
he suggests starting with personalized verb lists. It's not about memorizing the entire dictionary,
Right.
but choosing verbs that are aligned with your goals.
So if I'm learning Spanish for travel, I wouldn't prioritize verbs related to, say, astrophysics.
Exactly. Focus on what you'll actually use if it's travel. You want verbs for ordering food, asking for directions, things like that.
Right. It just makes the whole process less daunting and more relevant to my actual life. It's like I'm building a toolbox of verbs specifically for my needs. What else does Jaime suggest?
He's big on categorization,
Okay.
grouping verbs based on their pattern. So regular are air verbs, and then those irregular verbs, you can sort them by their quirks.
So instead of seeing them as this jumbled mess, you start to recognize the underlying logic.
Exactly.
It's like sorting your spices. Suddenly you can find what you need instead of just randomly grabbing jars.
That's a great analogy. I love that. And that leads us to Jaime's, I think, most crucial tip, which is practice.
Ugh, the P word. I knew it was coming.
It had to come up eventually, right?
Mhm.
But what kind of practice does he advocate?
Yeah.
He specifically recommends writing out verb endings multiple times.
Like old school pen and paper, really?
There's something about that physical act that really helps solidify the information.
Okay.
It's like the difference between reading about playing guitar and actually practicing chords.
Yeah, I can see that your brain and your hand are working together, forming that muscle memory, so to speak.
Exactly.
So we've got the verbs, we've got the practice tips now. How about actually using all this in conversation?
Right.
Jaime mentioned different uses of the present tense beyond just describing what's happening right now.
Right. So imagine yourself in that cafe in Spain. You could use the present tense to order.
Okay.
Quiero un café con leche, por favor. I want a coffee with milk, please.
Okay. And I get to tell my new friend about my day.
Exactly.
Normalmente trabajo por la mañana, pero hoy estoy explorando la ciudad. Normally I work in the morning, but today I'm exploring the city.
You see, even with just basic conjugations, you're expressing yourself, you're building connections.
I love it.
And as your skills grow, so do the possibilities.
This is getting me excited to practice.
That's great.
We've covered the fundamentals. Shimi's great advice. It feels like a solid foundation.
It is, and there's more to come.
Ooh.
In Part 3, we'll explore some common mistakes that learners make and Shimi's recommended resources for further study. So stay with us.
Okay, we are back for the final part of our Spanish verb conjugation deep dive. And I have to say, I'm feeling so much more confident about all this after covering all those great strategies and tips.
Yeah.
But I know there are still traps I could fall into.
Yeah.
What are some common mistakes that learners make?
One of the big ones is relying too heavily on translators.
Okay.
They can be helpful in a pinch,
Right.
but they don't always grasp those subtle nuances of verb conjugation.
So a translator might give me a grammatically correct sentence, but it might sound unnatural,
Oh, totally.
like a robot talking.
It's exactly like a robot talking. You miss out on that rhythm and flow of authentic Spanish.
Right.
And that's why it's so crucial to immerse yourself in real-world content, like music, movies, conversations with native speakers.
Yeah, it's like learning to cook. You can read recipes all day, but nothing beats actually getting in the kitchen and experimenting.
Exactly.
What other pitfalls should I watch out for?
Mixing up verb tenses is another common challenge. Spanish has a wider range of tenses than English,
Oh, yeah.
each with a specific shade of meaning.
So I might know the present tense conjugation, but how do I know when to use the preterite versus the imperfect?
That's where practice and exposure come in. The more you read and hear Spanish, the more you'll start to internalize those distinctions.
Okay, that makes sense. And of course, there are those tricky irregular verbs.
Always lurking.
Always lurking in the shadows, ready to trip me up.
Right, but remember, those irregular verbs are some of the most frequently used.
Okay.
So mastering them is like unlocking a treasure chest of expressive
So
vocabulary.
they're worth the effort.
They are.
Amy also mentioned some resources for further study. What did he suggest?
Online conjugation tools and apps are fantastic for practice and getting instant feedback.
Hmm.
There are also countless websites and textbooks that delve deeper into grammar.
It's amazing how many resources are available these days. I feel like there's no excuse not to improve.
I know, right?
So as we wrap up, what are the key takeaways you hope listeners will carry with them from this deep dive?
I hope they've discovered that Spanish verb conjugation is more than just a set of rules. It's a window into the soul of the language.
I love that. I know I've started to see these verbs in a whole new light. It's not just about memorizing endings. It's about understanding the logic and the expressiveness behind them.
Exactly.
And I hope listeners feel empowered to tackle those verbs with confidence, knowing that there are strategies and resources to support them every step of the way.
Absolutely. And most importantly, I hope they're inspired to keep exploring this beautiful language.
Yeah.
It's a journey, not a destination.
So well said. So as you continue your Spanish adventures, here's a question to ponder.
Yeah.
What aspect of verb conjugation intrigues you the most, and how do you plan to delve deeper into it?
Ooh, that's a good one. Let us know.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Hasta pronto.